happy to do, and what I was intending to do anyway, was to forward the slides to Peter in case he wanted those for any note making, and we can pass them on to anybody else who might want them, so you'll be able to maybe read them more clearly then.
Right, thank you.
So the topic for today then, the decline of truck building in the UK, and during this particular period here, the 1970s to the early part of this century. And maybe just important to say, I'm not so much focusing on absolute numbers as such, but really the decline of the number of manufacturers which there were in the UK. And I'm sure that you will come up with names perhaps which you are familiar with, which don't necessarily get a mention today. Okay, so moving on from there, and one of the basic questions I want to ask is whether we've actually moved from our descriptors of a lorry to a truck. On the left-hand side here, you can see what most people, certainly in the UK, would regard as being a lorry. It's actually an American Peterbilt, and this slide is taken from a film called Duel, which was Steven Spielberg's first film. If you've not seen it, I would very strongly recommend watching it when it next comes up on TV, because it's not just about a physical duel between a truck driver and a car driver, but very much about the psychological duel which they have between them. But
not plugged in.
The image which we've got here is, and indeed this is made very clear during the film.
The thing that you're holding.
Yeah, it isn't. No, it doesn't have to.
So Margaret, you able to mute the microphone, please?
Can I mute it? Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was trying to make it louder. Rob can't hear.
Okay.
I'll mute it.
Bottom left. Yeah. Great. Thank you. So what you've got here is a picture of a pretty filthy old vehicle, spewing oil, covered in filth. It is a tanker, obviously, but in other conditions it might be covered by a dirty old tarpaulin. And maybe that's our image over the years of lorries. Whereas on the right-hand side, the Eddie Stobart truck, which you've got there, is smart, a flashy paint job on it. All of the goods which it's carrying are hidden away from view. And this is very much a status symbol, if you like, in the haulage industry. So as part of what we are discussing today, are we moving from lorry through to truck? Just want to contextualize very, very briefly, because all of these are sort of pre the era which I'm going to talk about. Obviously, right at the outset, there were other forms of freight transport on our roads, whether it be by horse or ox, or indeed by stagecoach. And then you had the invention of the steam vehicle in France by Nicolas Cugnot. And of course, various manufacturers continued to experiment with steam into the 20th century. And not overlooking trains either, although of course they did have dedicated roads, railroads as the Americans call them. So we're not going to be talking directly about those either. Certainly there was the growth of motorized transport during the two world wars and the rise of many US manufacturers and designs for vehicles. It may be important to note that many ex-military vehicles were retained after demobilization, mostly for local transport because they weren't designed for either high speed or long distance work. Again, in the 1930s, there was the adoption of diesel fuel as being the principal motive power, although through the Second World War and beyond, there were, of course, still many petrol fueled wagons as well. And we move then into this post-Second World War, what was commonly called a golden age of road transport. So that's really where my starting point is going to be. But just to note that really the talk is going to focus on HGVs rather than vans. They do fall into a rather different category, and maybe we'll mention those a little bit later. And in the presentation, you'll see that there are some blue numbers in brackets which appear periodically, and those refer to extracts of our very own journal and to whichever journal edition it is for that. So that's just a little bit of contextualizing for where we start. So I'm starting then going through post-war into the early 1960s. And as happened in many aspects of industrial Britain post-Second World War, the emphasis was on export, in this case exporting vehicles in order to earn national income. And the export markets were principally to the British Commonwealth. So there was a focus on basic tough vehicles, many of which had to operate within rugged terrains or hostile climates. If you think about the spread of the British Commonwealth at that stage throughout Australia and New Zealand, of course many of the African countries as well. So what was prized very much was their ability to travel through the different sorts of terrains which are mentioned there. So we've got a picture here of two different Bedfords from that period. The first, obviously, in a domestic setting, the green Bedford on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, okay, hardly factory fresh, but you can see that there is a rather battered, but still working, large Bedford, in this case, actually in Kenya. And in both cases, obviously, the vehicles do look their ages. There was very little emphasis upon the developments by British manufacturers, for reasons that we'll come on to, in terms of technical development or indeed driver comfort as such. Moving through into the 1950s, well, the same attitude to the export of commercial vehicles was shared with cars. Generally, if it works, if it sells, keep producing it with established designs and powertrains, and very little emphasis really upon developing driver comfort. If you look at some of the motor cars of that era, which were large export numbers, vehicles like the standard Vanguard and so on were very, very common, and yet they appeared really quite old-fashioned. And then, of course, by the late 1950s, you can see here there was the start of the UK motorway network, the first one being the Preston bypass in 1958. And the development of the motorway network did bring about, as we'll see, different demands for all vehicles, but particularly for commercial vehicles. If you take a look at these two images here, both British Road Services vehicles, now what we've got here is on the left-hand side, we've got a Bristol from 1961, in the days when Bristol were still producing some commercial vehicles as opposed to buses as such. And on the right-hand side, a 1949 Leyland Octopus. But if you look at the two designs, if you look at the two vehicles, there's actually really very little difference between them. They are very similar in design, and maybe the only obvious difference is that the Bristol on the left has got this height of modern technical equipment, a roof rack on top of the cab. But otherwise, they actually look very similar. There certainly doesn't seem to be 12 years difference between them in terms of their design. And particularly if you take the one on the left-hand side, the Bristol, 1961, 3 years into the beginning of the motorway network, does it really look as if it is fit for the motorway era, which was developing? So that's one of the fundamental questions which we have. You can just see on this slide actually at the top where the Bristol HG is featured in one of our journals, the journal number being in blue there. So by the time we come through to the 1970s, which is really where I'm going to begin, there were a number of key changes taking place. I mean, firstly, there was a greater demand for road haulage post-beaching, with a lot of the more rural lines rail lines having been cut. And that was putting greater pressures on commercial vehicles. And the difference is really that vehicles are now expected to cover much greater distances, frequently on a motorway, of course, and as a result of that, be able to maintain a higher average speed rather than trundling along at a low speed. Incidentally, that image which we started off with, the Peterbilt fuel tanker, those Peterbilts are capable of tremendous speeds. I can remember being in the USA driving, about a dozen years ago, and seeing one of these vehicles in the rear view mirror of the rental car I was in, thinking, well, it's just going to stay at that distance. But it crept up, and they have a top speed, even then, of 75 to 80 miles an hour, and they use it as well. Now, okay, those speeds aren't achievable in the UK, nor were they used in the UK, but there was generally a much higher average speed as such. And allied to that, of course, the increase in the weight limit, which there was, particularly for articulated vehicles. You can see what those are in the indented lines on the slide there. So that had certainly gone up quite considerably. Vehicles covering a larger distance at a higher speed and needing to carry or being capable of carrying a heavier weight. And at the same time, for those vehicles to have a low operating cost, because all of those features would be pointless if the operating costs were sky high. And with that, because perhaps the drivers were going to be away overnight, or indeed for a number of nights, particularly with the growth of intercontinental travel, vehicles which were able to offer greater comfort to the driver, indeed an onboard bed as well. And with that, perhaps that is when we have the birth of trucks, as I defined them at the outset, rather than lorries as such. Now, all of that brought about something of a pressure as far as the UK marques were concerned. Okay, I'm just going to admit somebody, Simon here. And some of the UK manufacturers were very slow to adapt, and particularly to incorporate driver comfort as such, as we'll see in a bit more detail in a few moments. And it did mean that many of the established brands were struggling.
This is the annual general meeting of the Road Transport and Historic Association.
Hello. Okay, many of the brands were struggling. Ford really was starting to be out of its depth in terms of heavy vehicles and to move rather more into lighter goods vehicles. Various upgrades to the Ford's Thames Trader, as it was frequently known, but in the end, the struggle became rather too much for them. With Bedford, you may remember that back in issue 99 of the journal, there was an article written by me about the demise of Bedford vehicles, and that came down to a number of reasons, really. There was partly a political decision by the UK government, but there was certainly also a lack of investment in the trucks division, Bedford Trucks division, by the General Motors parent company, which was using the profits which Bedford did make in its exports, as we saw on an earlier slide, to basically subsidize the Vauxhall wing of the same company. That didn't make a profit for many, many years. There was also some fairly nugatory, pointless competition through family feuds, between particularly Foden and ERF, both based in the same town, and ERF being established really because the Foden family, or members of the Foden board, didn't want to move into the diesel era as such. And then the common name, something which I'm sure we're all very familiar with up until the 1970s, producing a variety of vehicles, a lot of them produced in Coventry, of course, where we usually meet. That name was replaced by Dodge in the 1970s after the US Chrysler takeover, and then went over under a number of other changes through the later years as well. So the UK was retaining a market, and an important market, but particularly for heavy, slow and low loader type of units, as we can see here. But there was the rise of various other, particularly continental manufacturers, who were putting pressure on the UK marques. Okay, and the consequences of that, well, there were several consequences. Many of the well-established brands, such as the ones you can see in the first bullet point, were subsumed into Leyland. Leyland kept going, but a lot of the other names were disappeared, and there was an element of badge engineering which took place not only with BMC and later British Leyland vehicles, but also with the Leyland Trucks division as well. Some of these famous names started to disappear, and they became really just sort of rebadged Leylands of some form or other, maybe with different engine configurations. The motor industry was certainly subject to political influence in the 1980s. We all remember that time, particularly with regard to BMC, which became British Leyland, which became Rover later, and so on. And that also had an impact as far as Bedford was concerned. Again, that article which I wrote in a previous edition about basically a political decision to go for a vehicle other than Bedford, despite the military's great support and adherence to the Bedford name as well. They wanted to go for Leyland because the government had put so much finance into this. And then likewise, the Italian conglomerate Iveco, Industrial Vehicles Corporation, takes this 52% interest in Ford trucks. And that's why we no longer tend to see large, heavy Ford trucks in the UK, or indeed across Europe. They were rebranded as Ivecos. And indeed, later on, they were to absorb Seddon Atkinson, just as the US company was to buy Foden and various other companies as well. So we were left with a market which was becoming dominated by these continental brands. DAF, Van Doorn Autofabric of Holland, even though many of those vehicles were actually British built, indeed built in the Leyland factory in Leyland in Lancashire, plus of course Scania, Mercedes-Benz, MAN, and Volvo. All of those tended to become much more common on our roads. But why? Well, here we've got a picture of a 1971 Volvo truck, the F86. Back in 1971, a larger version to the left-hand side. And the heading of this slide is, was this the truck that finished British trucks? Maybe what was really noticeable about this truck was not what you can see on the outside of the truck, but just taking a look at the inside, the cab of that Volvo. So different from what the British manufacturers were offering at that time. You can see the soft vinyl to the dashboard. You can see the thick carpeting which was there. You can see the plush seating which was there. It was something which looked much more like a car than a heavy-duty truck as such. And this made a significant difference to the buying of vehicles, and indeed particularly with the rise of owner operators themselves, as is very, very common in the US. This was really quite a significant breakthrough as far as truck design generally was concerned. And what I've got here is an extract from what one trucker says about this. I've corrected some of the typos which were here. But this guy, Frankie who, I don't know, but you can see what the link, the web link is here, indicating that yes, Volvo and particularly Scania had a significant impact upon the UK market as such, eventually overturning what the British operators or British manufacturers were able to operate, even where they were owned by US companies. If I just look at the second paragraph of that, I also remember the first F-86s, and they were no great shakes. Head gasket problems for a start. True, the quote of the day was by drivers was, "It's just like driving a car." And you remember that that second image, which we had on the previous slide, it does look much more car-like inside. But again, others thought that the industry was going soft, introducing motors like this. Not everyone in the 60s wanted sleeper cabs like they did 20 years later. They knew it would not be to their advantage in many ways, because obviously if the vehicle has got the scope to put up a driver overnight, then the expectation is a change in working conditions, that drivers will be expected to be away overnight, and gone perhaps are the days of putting up in a bed and breakfast or somewhere like that, but they'll be expected to sleep and to eat in the cab as such. So in summary, yes, early Scanias and Volvos did make an impact in Britain, but they were not solely responsible for the decline in UK vehicle manufacturing. If today's examples are anything to go by, Volvo and Scania have taken many steps back. Build quality is not the same as then. So says Frankie. And indeed, I have heard Scania, the meaning of Scania, described as Swedish crap always needing immediate attention. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But that was certainly a significant change as far as vehicles were concerned, and particularly the way in which the vehicle was going to be that much more user-friendly. Now, here I am referring to a previous edition of the journal, issue 59, page 7, where we had an article in that by Roy Larkin, who was indeed, at the time, 2009, when this was produced, the editor of the journal, entitled 30 Years of Globetrotting, and it features the impact which the Volvo F12 Globetrotter, as it was called, and maybe the name is significant, what it had upon him as a driver at that time. Not just the cab finish, which we've referred to, but the fact that it was ergonomic. Everything fell to hand, and this was a frequent response by potential drivers when they sat in the cab, that all the controls which they needed fell to hand. They didn't need to stretch over for things. That there was cab storage space. There was space above and behind the driver's seat. And importantly, and this is something which Roy Larkin makes a great deal of in this article, there was space to stand, to stretch, and to move around within the cab. And that was such a refreshing change from what they'd had to do before. If the weather was lousy outside, you could stand up, move around within the cab, you could change clothes, you could prepare a meal in the space which there was in the back. You weren't at the mercy of the weather outside. You had heaters on board, including night heaters as well. And actually, I can remember back in 1985, when I last moved house, that somebody, a neighbour where we previously lived, was also moving on the same day. And whereas our old Pantechnicon pulled up, ready to make the move to our current house, the other neighbour had got a company called Fox the Movers to do their moving, and they came with a very smart brand new Scania, which the drivers of our old truck went over to have a look at, because it had cost a stunning total of £30,000 in 1985. But Mr. Fox, the millionaire owner of the company, still would not install a heater in that particular vehicle for his drivers. That was one way he was going to make a saving. Even though the heater came as standard, he actually wanted it removed. But in general, Scanias, Volvos did have heaters, including night heaters, and that transformed the lifestyle for many of the drivers. Another key feature was the fact that Volvo in particular actively sought driver feedback. It shows they would have cabs or mock-ups of cabs which they would take around to the commercial vehicle shows, and they interviewed over a period of time, I think it was 2,000, just checking, 2,000 drivers, according to Roy Larkin, for what their feedback was on the vehicle design and facilities and the equipment which it had, and they made modest changes as a result of those. So that was a really significant change. Plus the fact that during this time, Volvo and other manufacturers were able to offer vehicles which operated both at a higher speed and indeed lower operating cost vehicles. And one of the ways in which they were able to achieve this, it was more likely, not always the case, but it was more likely that the complete truck was built by a single manufacturer rather than drawing in parts from various other manufacturers' components. So there was a cost saving which was reflected in the ownership costs as well. So this was a significant change. And indeed, if we have a look at a cutaway of a Scania cab, this time 2010, you can see the sorts of developments which there were. Okay, this is obviously 25, 30 years more modern than when those first Volvos and Scanias were coming in, but you can have a look at what the differences are here. First of all, you just look at the seat. That seat alone would be a very expensive piece of kit. It's very well upholstered. It obviously has fore and aft movement as well as a height control. You can see all the little electric buttons on the side there, the integral headrest. It's a comfortable place to be. And remember, as far as the driver is concerned, this is where he or she is working. So it's a comfortable workplace. It's a plush cabin inside, soft furnishings. You can see there's space for the bed behind. There is certainly space to stand up and move around. There's plenty of storage space in lockers overhead, behind, underneath. It's basically like a little caravan, the tractor cab up here. And that's a 2010 picture. No doubt today they're even better. So today we have a significant change as far as the vehicles are concerned, which are on our roads, and who actually makes the vehicles here. Now, I've given a web link here, which I know I'm not going to be able to draw up successfully, but this gives the leading HGV registrations for 2018, which are the most recent figures which are available. There's one rider to this, which I'll mention in a moment. But as a result of this, DAF trucks are actually the UK's most popular brand as far as HGVs are concerned. And you can see the figures here with Mercedes in second place for that. That's 12 in 2018. And you can see that the number of licensed HGVs has slowly increased over these years. Now, at the moment, I have to say, I think the number of registrations, and it's difficult to get current registration figures at the moment, will have dropped because of COVID. Because companies experiencing financial difficulties delaying purchasing new kit and so on. But there has actually been a tremendous rise through what has been called the Amazon effect, in the number of people who are now having goods delivered direct to their home via Amazon or through other online retailers, in terms of lighter vehicles, not HGV, but lighter vehicles. So Mercedes Sprinters, for example, the numbers for those have increased tremendously. Just the last point which you've got on that page there is that whilst there's been tremendous Japanese influence in the UK's car and motorbike market, we've seen very little direct influence as far as trucks are concerned. You don't see many Japanese trucks on the road apart from the occasional heavy tipper Hino, or for much lighter Isuzu and Mitsubishi Canter trucks, for example. They seem to dominate the market as far as light delivery vehicles for garages. If you see a single vehicle being transported between the different different branches of particular franchises, like to be on the back of a Mitsubishi Canter rather than anything else. The UK built vehicles seem to have missed out on that particular market. So here we've got a picture of some of the most registered HGV trucks according to those 2018 figures. The DAF, built in Leyland, in this case in TNT livery, but also very popular in position 5, the Iveco Eurocargo, a very similar looking vehicle in the same, operating in the same field. So yeah, foreign manufacturers' names, but do remember that the DAFs are principally still built in Leyland, in Lancashire. Now, if we just move on to this slide here and do a little bit of what I've called M4 I Spy, because obviously I live fairly close to the M4, and in Southwest Wales, these are the operators you are most likely to see on the road. And as you travel east into England, obviously, they become subsumed into other hauliers, although Downton is still very popular around the southwest of England. And quite a few of these vehicles obviously are DAFs. Nolan, by far the biggest operator here, is actually an Irish company, so they all come over on the ferries from the Republic of Ireland, but they have exclusively a DAF fleet. Bottom left, Mansell Davis use exclusively Volvos, and indeed they are a Volvo truck dealership as well. You see plenty of these vehicles taking milk from Carmarthenshire and Pembrokeshire up the M4 to London for processing in the dairies up there. Owens actually seem to use virtually every brand, but in this case, what we've got featured here is an MAN. And then Downton, as you can see, bottom right, again, particularly in the southwest of England, but using DAFs in particular. So just moving back from there, hopefully I've answered the issues which I set out to, is what were the reasons for the decline in the number of UK-based manufacturers, why we've lost some of those famous heritage names, and they've been replaced by these large conglomerates, which we see operating these days, most of them being built abroad, of course. In this case here, every single truck you can see has got space for a sleeper cab, and they're all high-topped as well, so plenty of storage space above the driver as well. That's the norm for heavy goods vehicles, or certainly on motorway journeys these days. A number of references which I've used here, and again I can make these available via Peter for anybody who wants them. Some interesting books and materials which were here. Most of the images which I've used have been from Wiki Commons, and again we've got some of the references on the final sheet, which is here. I'll just say that the very first one, which we had, the image from the dual film, is actually a copyright one, so I will acknowledge that one here. So, thank you very much. And now, any questions, comments, or discussion about any of the points